Hello. So this lecture is going to be a brief review of the history of psychology. So the history of psychology abridged. So the first thinking, people have always thought about why people behave as they do. In a phenomenon called theory of mind, people have always tried to identify why others around them were behaving as they did. But thinking about it formally really didn't begin until, or at least our first record of it begins with the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, such as Aristotle. You should all read Allegory of the Cave if you haven't got a chance. It's pretty cool. But as with a lot of philosophy, there's very little experimentation. So for the majority of time, thinking about why people do what they do was really an exercise in thought. People just sat back and thought about it. Well, in the 1800s, specifically the mid to late 1800s, is when psychology, as we know it, began to form. And you can think of psychology as the child of philosophy, which had been the leader in thought about why people do as they do, and physiology. And I say physiology because much of the early work in psychology was actually testing the parameters of human sensation and perception. Therapy wasn't even on the board. Therapy didn't show up until the 1930s. So, psychology was going on its own for about 30 years before Freud or therapy ever showed up. Now, in the time before Freud, when experimental psychology was alive and well, and it's still alive and well, but therapy has kind of taken the limelight. But in that time before Freud and before clinical psychology became what everybody associated with psychology, there were two large ways of thinking about psychology. The first was functionalism, and it was championed by the person that many people consider the father of modern psychology, and his name is William James. He published the first textbook in psychology in the 1880s called The Principles of Psychology. Now, he was the father of a way of thinking about psychology known as functionalism. Now, functionalism focused on trying to identify the functions that each behavior served. Now, the other field of thought was structuralism, and it was founded by a German by the name of William Wundt. I guess it's German, so it's William Wundt. So, William Wundt and his students were focused on, they actually tried to think about consciousness like a chemist would a solution. Basically, they tried to identify the basic elements, or the basic structures of structuralism, that comprise this complex solution that we experience as consciousness. Wundt and one of his most popular students, Titchener, were the ones who did all sorts of research to try and identify these basic elements. Now, the way they identified these basic elements is they trained participants in the art of or in the process of introspection. Now, introspection was this process whereby you thought about the experience that you were having and you tried to break it down to its percepts or its basic elements. Okay? Rather than, so if, I'm holding this water bottle. Okay? If Titchener or Wundt were to ask me, okay, so what are you holding? Well, I'm inclined to say this is a water bottle. But they would say, no. We need you to engage in a little bit of introspection and really think about what you're actually perceiving, what you're actually experiencing. And so they would make me break it down into its the individual components of that perception. So I would say, well, it's a cylindrical object. It's fairly heavy. It appears to have some liquid, some kind of easily movable, non-solid element inside. It is primarily dark in color, principally black, except for a small area towards the center of the cylinder that spells the words healthy agonies. Okay? Now, they would probably go into far more detail than that, but that's a rough idea of what structuralists would have their participants do. Now, they had to train their participants to do this, so they couldn't just use anybody that just walked off the street. They'd have to take them, and they'd have to train them, and then that's how they identified these elements. Now, around the 30s and 40s, Freud showed up, but at the same time in experimental psychology, a new movement happened that changed the face of experimental psychology for a good 30 to 40 years. So, first we'll talk about that movement in experimental psychology. In the 1930s, a fellow by the name of Watson came out and he wrote this article in which he argued that if we could not directly observe it, then it would be unscientific to study it. And so Watson emphasized that to be truly scientific, psychology had to eliminate all questions with regards to what is going on in the head. Remove all questions having anything to do with mental life or mental experience. So your thoughts, your feelings, all of that, not scientific to study, or at least that's what Watson said. Now, he didn't actually take behaviorism very far because of some shenanigans he was pulling with his students, and so he ended up going into advertising and making a very lucrative career, and had a very lucrative career doing that. The champion, the man who became the champion of behaviorism, was a fellow by the name of B.F. Skinner. And he was fairly strict in his behaviorist thought, so far that the most strict behaviorists can often be referred to as Skinnerian behaviorists. Basically, they think that everything, all mental life, literally everything that any organism ever does, is the result of a lifetime of learning, and the rules of learning, which extensive research in behaviorism identified. So operant conditioning, classical conditioning, which are basic ways that describe classical and operant conditioning are ways that people, not just people, all organisms learn anything. There are other ways that they learn too, but these are the two very reliable ways that behaviorists identify. And we'll talk more about operant and classical conditioning in chapter 5. But as far as Skinner was concerned, everything that any organism ever did was the result of learning, especially humans. So behaviorism, for the next 30 years, really focused on principles of learning, how organisms acquire new behaviors, how those behaviors might go away, and then constructed models for human learning, or just animal learning, which can be and are applied to all organisms. In fact, if you want to learn how to train your dog, learn classical and operant conditioning. If you want to train your children, learn classical and operant conditioning. So that's behaviorism, and I often refer to the time of behaviorism as the dark ages of psychology, because during that time, it's really taboo to think about anything inside the head, unless you were a clinician. So around the same time that behaviorism became a big thing in experimental psychology, Freud developed his way of thinking about psychology, which has come to be referred to as psychoanalysis. Now, he focused on unconscious drives and unconscious conflicts that occurred, that drove behavior. All right, so he highlighted the id, the ego, and the superego. We'll talk more about those in the personality chapter, and how these interacted to produce behaviors. So obviously, he thought they were unconscious. Obviously, he had no problem with thinking about what was going on inside the head, and he assumed that, and he thought that you could identify, that a therapist could identify these unconscious processes through therapy and through psychoanalysis, through dream interpretation. Now, psychoanalysis and Freud really became the face of psychology for a long time. Now, contrary to popular belief, psychoanalysis, while still done, is no longer, by any stretch of the imagination, the dominant clinical perspective used in therapy. And empirical psychology doesn't use it at all. Occasionally, we'll use, some of the thoughts that Freud had used to develop hypotheses, but his theory has been all but abandoned because it's not good. It's not a very good theory. It's not testable. Certain elements of it are, but not many of them of those. Not much of Freud's theory is terribly testable. And as researchers, as scientists in empirical psychology and experimental psychology, if an idea can't be tested, we don't really have much use for it. And a lot of Freud's theory can't be tested, so we don't use it. Also, it's not really the dominant therapeutic orientation anymore. So often people who haven't taken a general psychology class think that we're all still Freudian, that Freud has a still to this day has a major impact on psychology. He doesn't. The biggest thing he did for us is give us a face. So he made people realize that we were a thing. But that's really it. Some of his defense mechanisms are still used in modern clinical therapy, but that's really about it. And very little of it's used in experimental science. However, the dominant therapeutic orientation actually reflects the same paradigm shift that happened in experimental psychology about the same time. So it's kind of funny because as far as psychology was concerned, you had experimental psychology going along, then therapy popped off. And they went in exact opposite directions. Experimental psychology with behaviorism came to ignore everything inside the head, and psychoanalysis decided to care only about what was going on in the head, and in fact decided that people may not be aware of what was going on inside the head, but the therapist could figure it out. In the 50s and 60s, they kind of converged again thanks to the cognitive revolution. Now, in the 50s and 60s, the computer people became very aware of the computer, and the computer became a organizing metaphor for thinking about human behavior and mental life. So, just like a computer, well, let's think about what happens to a computer. So you have the tower, and it has all the software and the programs inside of it. You can think of the brain as the tower, okay, where all the software and all the programs are. And then you can think of the environment as the input. So, for example, when you type on your keyboard, or when you move your mouse, or if you have a touch screen, when you touch the screen. These are all inputs that then go to the tower or go to the processor in your iPad, and then some technical magic happens, and then you get some output. So on your computer, you get output on the screen, you get output in the speakers. Same thing with your tablet. You touch something, it goes into the processor does something, and then you have output on the screen and in the speakers. Sometimes the tablets also have tactile feedback, but that's all output. So what's on the screen, what you hear from the speakers, the vibrations that you might feel, these are all output. With human behavior, the output is behavior. So the environment serves as the keyboard and mouse and touching for your brain. Your brain does all the system, the processing, all that jazz, and then outputs behavior. Now that metaphor became incredibly useful. And in fact, both clinical and experimental psychology started using it. In fact, so now, today, the most common therapeutic orientation is cognitive behavioral. Almost all of the scientific fields of psychology today, almost all of the experimental fields of psychology today, have cognition as its underlying framework. So what do I mean when I refer to cognition or cognitive psychology? Well, cognitive psychology emphasized identifying the mental processes that convert or take input and then produce output. So cognitive psychology became really good at finding ways of changing the input and then figuring out what process was going on in the head to produce an output. They would do that by changing the input and seeing if the output would change in the way they expected it to. So they would say, well, I think this process is happening, and if it is, then if I change this thing, the outcome will look like this. But if I change this thing, the outcome will look like this. And so you had research that was able to illuminate multiple processes going on in the head. Now, to this day, cognitive psychology is the underlying framework or the foundation of almost all of psychology. I am by training a social psychologist, and I was telling my colleague today, roughly 90% of social psychology is social cognition. Almost everything has at its foundation cognition. In fact, most neuroscience or biological psychology works to identify the neural substrates or the parts of the brain that generate cognition. So cognition is really the driving force or the fundamental force behind psychology today. But today we have multiple fields. So most people still think that psychology is all about therapy or clinical work. This is not true. Now, don't get me wrong. A huge part of psychology is therapy. But there are many of us who have doctorates in psychology who are not trained as therapists. I, for one, am like most experimental psychologists, and I've never taken a single class in anything remotely therapy. So I couldn't even try to treat a person with some kind of issue, even if I wanted to. I'm not trained to do that. I'm trained as a scientist of human behavior. I treat, and all experimental psychologists do this, I study human behavior as a physicist studies physical phenomena. And that's really the distinction. Now, probably a more clear distinction between clinical and experimental psychology follows the distinction between basic and applied psychology. Basic psychology, basic research, simply tries to identify the mechanisms and processes that generate behavior. That's it. Applied psychology then takes that information from basic psychology, basic research, and then tries to apply it to all manner of problems that people face on a daily basis. Clinical psychology is an applied field of psychology. It takes the research and then tries to apply it to help people work through their issues. But clinical psychology isn't the only applied field of psychology. You have applied fields of psychology such as human factors. If you have a computer, if you have a car, if you have any kind of machine, you have encountered the work of what is called a human factor psychologist. Human factor psychologist is an experimental psychologist that tries to make sure that the designs that engineers make can actually be used by people. Engineers are trained to make these fantastic, wonderful designs. However, they take all of about 2 classes in what people can actually do, and that's only if they go get a graduate degree. If I'm not mistaken, most undergraduate degrees require at most 1 class in psychology, meaning you have these engineers who make these great designs, but they're not always aware of whether or not people can actually use them. So human factor psychologists, sometimes referred to as engineering psychologists, actually make sure that the engineer's designs can be used by people. So that's an example of an applied experimental psychology. But let's talk about other big fields in modern psychology. Your book highlights biological psychology. Now, biological psychology is great. And at one time they thought that biological psychology was going to take over all psychology. But given the restraints of how costly the materials to study to answer biological questions are, it's not taken over the field quite as people expected it to. So what is biopsychology? Well, biological psychology really tries to identify the neural substrates or what's happening in the brain to create cognition or conscious experience. Okay. Another modern field of psychology that your book emphasizes is the social cultural perspective. Now, the social cultural perspective really tries to look at differences between cultures and groups, and it kind of gets subsumed in the minefield of psychology, which I've mentioned is social psychology, which social psychology is not a new thing. Social psychology is actually as old as behaviorism is. In fact, it started around the same time. But uh, it kind of got subsumed in cognition and a bunch. It got subsumed in behaviorism. It got subsumed into cognition. It is its own field. But social cultural is one sub area of social psychology. It tries to identify differences within culture and how cultural differences lead to differences in behavior. Speaking as a social psychologist, cultures are not as distinct as people believe they are. They are distinct, but they're not quite as distinct as people believe they are. So yeah, I believe those are the highlights. If you have any questions about the history of psychology, please send me an email. Please ask me. Otherwise, I hope this video has been informative, and I hope it's answered a lot of your questions. As I said, if it hasn't, send me your questions. Alright.